You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. Who was that? It's the cactus. Here we go.
You just can't quit.
It's a majority government.
You heard it from the cactus.
The election was
It's a
called.
majority government. The cactus has spoken. Welcome, guests. Yes, we've just had the announcement of majority government from the cactus, but also from the Lieutenant Governor yesterday, invited Premier David Eby to continue on in office. So that's what we're going to get into today. Kate Hammer, our trusty front desk clerk, will be away for the next 4 weeks. So you won't.
Long time.
It's a long time. So I still have my old buddy here, Geoff Meggs, who will join me today at the hotel. Geoff, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yeah, we're going to miss her. She's gone all the way to the Southern Hemisphere, so maybe even out of reach of Hotel Pacifico podcast. I don't know.
Maybe. She's I think the toilets are going backwards or flushing backwards wherever she's going. But we've had a crazy week of lots of close call, lots of recounts, lots of electoral margins decided by less than 100 votes. It bears mentioning before we get into it with our guest today that while there was some chirping about the election process, it has been strongly defended by all parties, including the Conservatives, John Rustad and other officials like Aisha Esti, the party president. So I think we can put to rest any concerns that the voting machines were were improper or somehow ballots were missing. That's not the way we do things in British Columbia, and we have an honest and fair result. Asterisks pending potential judicial recounts. But our guest today, we're pleased to welcome Della Mattia, who was the campaign director for David Eby's campaign and who has a history of winning campaigns for the NDP in British Columbia and I think in other places as well. And a very important behind the scenes person who many of our listeners may have never heard from directly before, but will have seen her work represented through in other ways. Marie, welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
Thanks for having me. What a delight. And you caught me on a good morning.
Well, it should be a good morning. It took 8 days, but you won the election yesterday.
Yeah. Well, people were pretty excited last night when we heard the results, and everybody's ready to get to work and take on the new challenges. Yeah, for sure.
Now, how were you feeling on election night? I mean, I think you probably felt it was going to be close, but
yeah,
it was a seesaw. It was obviously I've been in those shoes before too. It's kind of an out of body experience. But what was going through your mind at around say 9:30 p.m.?
Yeah. I mean, it's not about me, but I was sitting there thinking, I can't believe this is happening again.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was very tight race. We knew from the beginning that it would be. And sitting there after kind of thinking through the new way of counting, and everything the results were gonna come in really fast and all of that, and then we're like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to wait that much longer for all of the results to come in. Like, quick turnaround on each ballot box being counted is one thing. It's another thing when you have to wait to find out like who actually won each individual race, and they were so tight in so many places that as soon as we started to see like closer to 9:30, we knew it was going to be a long evening for sure.
Marie, did you think it would be a battleground in Surrey the way it turned out to be, or did you think it would be elsewhere?
Yeah. So, fun fact: I grew up in Surrey, Guildford,
Wow.
and so
Secret weapon.
Surrey, they're my people, and so we knew all along that Surrey was a big place where it's an area where elections are often decided anyway. But we knew it would be a big battleground for both us and the Conservatives, and everyone was putting a lot of resources in there and really trying to on the ground and in our communication, our air war communications, really connect with people there about the things that they were challenged by, and wanting to make sure that we had ideas to solve those problems. So yeah, we knew from the get-go that would be a big part of the.
How would you qualify that challenge? Because we've heard a lot of speculation about what it's about, and it's north of the Fraser, south of the Fraser. All of those things are true, but what was the question that you felt voters needed answered in Surrey that was so important to them?
Yeah, I think a lot of what happened in Surrey was around, I mean, everywhere I think it was economic security and people's personal relationship with housing and the cost of living and those kinds of things. But I also think in Surrey, particularly, healthcare was a big focus for folks. The Surrey Memorial Hospital, the new hospital, the kinds of things that people were hearing in kind of the local Surrey media, which is mostly the Punjabi media, both in English and Punjabi. Hear what kinds of things they were hearing there. Everyone who lives in Surrey, my parents still live there, right? Everyone who lives in Surrey has interacted with the hospital or healthcare there, and so a lot of that, I think a lot of that frustration and concern about healthcare in Surrey was a big part of things.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like to contest a party that you had no history with, really? I mean, for the last 7.
Well, did we?
Well, good point. But for the last 7 elections, it was
Yeah.
BC Liberal Party as your main contender.
Yeah.
Very much strong connection with the business community. Very much, for much of that time, a business labor type of fight between BC Liberals and NDP. I mean, it's kind of evolved over the years in terms of the nature of the competition, but the Conservatives brought something different. So how did your campaign come to grips with that?
So I mean, for us, like I said earlier, the attention that we were paying was to people and their problems and the challenges that they were facing at home and with their jobs and with opportunities for their kids and the cost of living and the cost of housing. All of those things were kind of the core of what we knew we were campaigning on, and wanting to tell a story and make sure we were telling a story about what the different choices meant for people and what the consequences would be if Conservatives got power. And that, I think, like that was our focus all along. It shaped up a little differently as the campaign opened up and people started paying a little bit more attention to some of their candidates and some of the ideas coming from John Rustad himself and some of that. And we wanted to make sure we daylighted some of that as well, because it was really concerning, like the consequences for people with some of the things that were really kind of core of what they believed. The last time I saw some of those attitudes play out in a campaign was in the 2019 campaign federally, like when the People's Party of Canada was on the scene, and I can remember, going to events, even in the by-election in Burnaby when Jagmeet Singh first was running. There were some of the feelings that were being expressed and being talked about in this campaign. Those were starting to bubble up then, that everything from the anti-racism, the anti-climate denial stuff, all of that was kind of burbling, I would say, but being talked about openly, right? Like, and that I think that was kind of the interesting feature of this campaign was was some of those views were being kind of daylighted as almost like mainstream. Okay, this is all right to be saying and talking about and tolerated. Like even though John Rustad condemned some of the things that his candidate said, he didn't do anything about it. He didn't say, he didn't say, not in my house, out you go, right? He didn't do that. Which I think, in another era, in another time, that might have happened. But it didn't here, which is super concerning, I think, for people.
Yeah, I think you're right on what the rules of the game seem to have changed a little bit, because I think in some previous campaigns, the tolerance level for a candidate who's goes off message could be instant like that.
Yeah.
And the Conservatives didn't want to kick Brent Chapman out of caucus, obviously.
No,
because they didn't.
No, and I think that's a conservative technique. Like, I mean, you said at the beginning, like I've done this for a while across the country, and that is a conservative technique. We are going to stand and bull through, right? Like just, muscle through whatever crazy stuff we got going on in kind of this collection of opinions and beliefs and values, and not like there's no consequences for the candidate, but there's definitely consequences for people if those attitudes end up
when I
in power.
looked at the campaign, I was, we need to spend more time on the content of the campaign, but the form really struck me too, because when I saw David Eby's campaign launch, there was a bus, there was advertising, there was rallies, there were people doing Burma shaving. It was familiar form, very, very executed at a very, very high level of professionalism. I look over at the Conservative campaign and I'm thinking, is this a campaign? There's a guy with a podium, there's no backdrop,
no bus,
minimal infrastructure. When you looked at the Conservative campaign, what did you see, and did you detect things that the public might have missed?
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of Doug Ford's campaigns. Right? It had a lot of the similar feel. Like, we don't get out too much. We don't take very many questions. We pretend like our opponent isn't there in some ways. And it was it had some of the same vibes. And I think that they could do that because they had a strong brand connection to Pierre Poilievre and the federal Conservatives, that they were kind of riding on that reputation. And I mean, you saw it in some of their ads, right? They were running against Justin Trudeau as much as they were running against David Eby. And they made a point of, towards the end, even kind of setting John Rustad aside a little bit and not really focusing on him a whole heck of a lot either. So, I think you're right. I think, Geoff, it was not a traditional campaign with a bus and all of those things. But I also think it was kind of guerrilla style, putting stuff out there.
Did they have a good ground game? Did they have that kind of infrastructure that you could
I think they did. I think they did, like the rumors that I heard, and you may have heard some of the same ones. They had kind of a collection of suppliers, and those people were running their games, whatever those were, like the texting program and the phone bank program and the whatever those things were, and they were they were doing that work on the ground. Their candidates talked about how much they were door knocking and stuff like that. So they weren't absent at all from that.
Do you think you'd need a bus next time?
I don't know. We talked about the bus and whether we needed the bus. And I think the bus helps energize your people, right? Like, it isn't about getting the media around. You can get the media, like the media will get around.
They'll get around.
However, right? We learned that in COVID. Like, we had a bus in COVID, but we didn't have any media on it. But the bus is the bus is it's an exciting thing when it rolls into an event, and it gets our people excited. It motivates them. It's a rallying point. They see it on the road. It's a traveling billboard. It has lots of things going for it, and it also gets the media. Like we had more media at our events, probably than the Conservatives did, because we were transporting them to and from things. But it's I'm glad we did it. We thought about not doing it, but I'm glad we did it, because it did really energize our people, which when you're going for a third term, that's a big part of it, is giving your people the motivation to come out, to get excited, to feel part of something, to get excited about the leader, like who's on the bus. People are getting their picture taken in front, like all of that kind of stuff. It energizes people.
What did you make of John Rustad's opening event at Crab Park? It was very unconventional, at least in my mind, where there was no cheering mob behind him for the kickoff event. It was a kind of a stark setting. He was obviously trying to make a point, but what did you have a take on that when it happened, or were you too busy just thinking about getting your own day one going?
Yeah, I had other things on my mind. Yeah. I mean, I can see why he did that and why he chose to do it that way. Like from the beginning, they wanted to make the election about crime and safety, because that's what they needed to do in order to come out on top, right? Like that's what they did, because that's what they felt they needed to do. So it didn't surprise me that that's where he was and what he chose to talk about. But it was, visually, it was a different approach, right? Yeah.
Because either you're driving a message, or you're showing momentum, right? I mean, sometimes you can do both at once, but they certainly set aside the, hey, we're on the rise, and started with a serious note, which was a bit of a curveball, I guess.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, go ahead, Geoff.
No, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was also curious about the days before the writ dropped, where David Eby made some important policy announcements on carbon tax and voluntary care. Carbon tax different from what he'd been saying up till then, but involuntary care consistent with what he said right from his leadership bid. But still, did they play a big role, do you think, in removing possible attacks from the Conservatives in the days that followed?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it was when I think about sort of the carbon tax, and a lot, like I said at the beginning, like a lot of what we wanted to talk about and intended to talk about were costs and consequences for people. Like the things that we've done as a government have been in the interests of making life more affordable, and strengthening healthcare, and putting an effort into building more housing so people have homes they can afford. Like all of those priorities were mission critical, I think, for the NDP government from the get-go, but extra for David Eby in his last 2 years. He was, in the last 2 years, he was really hit the ground running and really wanted to make progress on those things, and lots of action was taken, and lots of results were starting to come through on a bunch of those things. And so, having a story to tell that sort of drove that home for people, and making sure that we were daylighting it in all of our events and everything that we were doing. That was a big part of the communication effort, and I think of David's, like David, right? Like it's him too. It's his brand and what he really believes in, like this determination and this kind of courage to kind of like charge in, and even if some people don't like it, it's to say, but this is what's right for most people, right? Like that really is what motivated him, and it kind of fueled his government in the last 2 years, but it also fueled the campaign.
Yes, we've talked before about TELUS's Indigenous reconciliation commitment and action plan. Since becoming Canada's first technology company to launch a reconciliation action plan in 2021, TELUS has fostered continuous learning and engagement among team members. Starting today and spanning the next few weeks, we'll explore TELUS's ongoing initiatives to fulfill its reconciliation commitments, beginning with their team members' learning journey. To date, more than 20,000 team members have completed TELUS's Truth and Reconciliation e-learning, created in partnership with Chastity Davis-Alphonse, a proud member of the Tla'amin and Chilcotin Nations. The course discusses the resiliency of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous-led movements in the face of colonial systems, and draws attention to the far-reaching and ongoing consequences of the residential school system, day schools, the 60 Scoop, and the Indian Act. Teams at TELUS are empowered to continue their learning in practical and relevant ways. To date, the TELUS retail team has hosted 6 cultural learning sessions with elders of the communities whose territories the stores are located on. TELUS is fostering a culture of continuous learning about Indigenous issues and reconciliation. It's all part of TELUS's approach to meaningful reconciliation, its commitment to addressing important social issues in Canada, and what it means to be BC's hometown team.
So in late August, you would have been fair to assume that you were heading into an election with the BC Conservatives and BC United. And then one day, Kevin Falcon shows up at a news conference with John Rustad, and everything changes. Well, how did the campaign react to that? Because I mean, I guess you may have thought it was always a possibility, but by late August, it was seeming to be a remote possibility.
Yeah, not for me. I always thought they would get it together. I never thought otherwise. And I think a lot of us were in that space. Like it, this is an NDP government that a bunch of people, were who had a lot of power and interests. Were determined to defeat, and they convinced Kevin Falcon to step aside in order to do that. And like, I was I sure which one of them they would convince to step aside? No, but they managed to get them to get together in some manner, even if it was at the expense of some of their MLAs. But I never expected otherwise. Like it was like the powerful interests in British Columbia that wanted to defeat us would always, I think, find a way to work together. That was never something I didn't believe.
Well, in believing
I've seen this movie a few times.
In believing that could happen.
Amen to that.
Thanks, Geoff. Thanks for the backup.
Sorry about that.
Right. Like, I mean, it was always part hope they stay separate. Sure. Yeah. But we were never expecting. I mean, we had ads ready the next day after Kevin Falcon's announcement with John Rustad that were John Rustad focused ads. Like we did not expect that that's what we would be doing. We had some leaflets with Kevin Falcon on them, which we had to, quickly give out, and then have new leaflets just with John. But our ads were already, kind of clearly defining John Rustad and what he would mean for people.
Well, going back a little bit further, at what point did you think John Rustad was going to be your main contender instead of Kevin Falcon?
I would say by the end of the session in May, right. We were pretty confident that folks were going to go like, this is our best bet is John Rustad and a conservative brand rather than Kevin Falcon and a BC United brand. They just weren't like. People didn't know who they were. Like people, it was confusing, and they didn't know what this party was even, right? Like, are they liberals? Are they conservatives? Are they like they didn't know what United was.
In anticipating that this could happen, though, was there? Did you envision a scenario that would have been worse than what happened for you? Like, were you concerned that maybe the ingredients of a deal might have been more appetizing to the electorate than? I mean, they came pretty close as it was, but was there anything they left off the table that you thought, geez, they should have done that if they were smart?
I'm not going to give them that kind of advice, Mike. Like, come
Well,
on.
so hey, you already won, you know.
I'm still a New Democrat, even if I'm retiring.
I doubt that, but I doubt the retiring part. But
Always happening.
just to stop at the debate briefly, because this
Sure.
picks up on the Rustad thing. I mean, even sort of whatever you term exit polling, people thought David Eby did very, very well in the debate and that John Rustad did poorly. And then subsequently, Rustad wound up spending almost the rest of the campaign trying to explain or avoid explaining his candidates. I mean, he really, there was, he was, and the NDP campaign, quite appropriately, tried to amplify those concerns and problems and talk about them a lot. What struck me was how resilient Rustad's vote was in the face of a week and a half of, frankly, dismal campaign. Did that surprise you? And have you got any reasons why you think that was the case?
Yeah, I mean, I have this belief that I've had in the last, like, since kind of the dawn of the internet campaigning era, as opposed to like watching television campaigning era, that it takes 6, 7 days for most people to hear whatever we're putting out there. Like, it is not the news happens and I know tomorrow. Like, that is not the world we live in anymore. It takes a while. And I think some of what was happening in that last week, people didn't know before they voted on election day. Now, we had a lot of early voting, which is a whole other topic, but and I think a lot of people had their mind made up long before the campaign. Which I think is also a factor. Like, people kind of dig in and they have their beliefs, and these are my values. This is where I land, and they don't move off of that. But when it comes to persuasion and it comes to that group of people who, they've got a busy life and they're only paying part attention. And, I think of my sisters, who I always think of, like, she's got teenage kids and she's got 2 jobs and she's doing a bunch of things. It's always a week and a half later before she's like, oh yeah, that thing. And that's just because that's how she consumes information. She's not watching the news every night. She's not checking the Twitter. She's not like.
Well, I'm trying to explain a 5-year-old tweet, worrisome and objectionable as it is a much tougher job than saying everything is going wrong and we should blow it up.
Yeah, totally. And now, like, I think now that this is, some of the folks that we raised alarm bells about are elected, I think that's going to change the conversation a little bit more. Like, these people are now in leadership positions in their community. And, as people start to think about, okay, well, my 12-year-old kid is going to go to school, and maybe they wear a turban, or maybe they're gay, or maybe, something else. And they're going to go to school and they're going to sit beside someone who might be emboldened by some of these things, thinking it's okay to bully them or say racist things or say, homophobic things or whatever it is. And that like that's when I think that people will really feel the consequences, and like I despair of that. I think that's horrible. But it brings it alive in a way that is very different from what we were able to do in a campaign, right? You couldn't paint that picture in the same way. But we could raise the alarm bells and say, like, these are the consequences. Right. And it's scary.
I think too that it's challenging for a campaign that is seeking the votes of people who may be considering the Conservatives to launch these negative and in my view appropriate counterattacks without saying anybody who supports John Rustad may hold those views. Right. I think that's a challenge for contrast advertising during that kind of a debate.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were really, we were careful not to do that. Like, this was not about saying, like, everybody who likes Conservatives holds those views. Like, what we were trying to say was leadership means saying this is not okay. right? And Rustad, John Rustad didn't take up that challenge, right? He said it's not okay, but he didn't do anything about it, right?
Yeah.
And so those views get to live on. They get validated, they get to live on, and they're going to continue to live on
They're
in those
normalized.
MLAs.
Yeah.
In those MLAs. So
Yeah.
I'd be very curious to see what happens. Like, when they're in the hallways of the legislature, they're going to have to encounter the media. Like what happens then? They can't hide in a closet.
Are you an electricity generation provider with experience delivering projects in Canada? Our sponsor, FortisBC, wants to hear from you. FortisBC is seeking power providers to bring new or existing projects online and increase the amount of electricity available for its customers. FortisBC has issued a formal request for expressions of interest for additional power to support the energy needs and economic growth of BC's southern interior, where the company delivers electricity. Some of our listeners might not be aware that FortisBC owns 4 hydroelectric generating plants on the Kootenay River, which allow their over 190,000 electric customers to receive approximately 1,609 gigawatt hours of energy supply each year. They meet the remainder of their customers' energy requirements by purchasing electricity. But they need more energy to meet the growing energy needs of its customers in the future. FortisBC is looking for power providers with a focus on developing innovative, renewable, and lower carbon energy sources, including biomass, biogas, hydroelectricity, solar, wind, and geothermal projects. FortisBC is particularly interested in new or existing projects that have a strong Indigenous equity component or are Indigenous-led. Ensuring customers have the energy they need when they need it is of critical importance for FortisBC. That's why FortisBC is looking to add up to 1,100 gigawatt hours of energy supply as soon as 2030. To learn more, visit fortisbc.com/newpower. FortisBC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast. On your path to victory, as narrow as it was, one of the key factors that strikes me is the Greens. And they fell from roughly 15% of the popular vote to about 8% of the popular vote, even though they held 2 seats. What was your approach in dealing with Green voters that may have considered voting, if they had a Green candidate in the riding, voting for the Greens as opposed to the NDP? Because certainly you could see the impact in ridings where there wasn't a Green. That arguably made the difference for the NDP winning a seat in like Coquitlam Burke Mountain, for example. But where you had to deal with the Green, you had a bit of an issue there, like a potential problem.
Yeah, I mean, a long time ago, one of our colleagues, Geoff, and I have worked with him for many years, taught me that Green voters are like NDP voters, and often our people, like, they overlap, right? Like our people are switchers, right? Like we're in a universe where there's a lot of overlap, and for a lot of people, like they kind of think of us as the same almost. And in the minority parliament with the Green support, it just reinforced that perception. I mean, I think it existed before, and it I think it continues now. And part of our approach with Green voters is to kind of see that and say that, right? There's more that unites us than divides us, and talking about the priorities that we share and the things that we feel strongly about, action on climate. But also, Green voters care a lot about healthcare. They care a lot about housing. They care a lot about all kinds of things that we also, cost of living, all kinds of things that we also care about. And sometimes what I've found in the data and the research is often they care more intensely, right? Like it's like they're saying I'm voting Green because maybe they think, oh, the NDP hasn't done enough about that, or I want them to do more about that, or they're kind of sitting there because they're feeling more intensely about whatever that issue is. And and I think that's been the case for many, many years in British Columbia, where there's an intensity of feeling that, but it's not just about climate. It's not just about the environment. It's about other issues as well. I think David really kind of went into this campaign wanting to speak to those voters, wanting to have people on his team who were connected to some of those issues that we knew were important to cross-pressured NDP Green folks, and we didn't really want to think of it as like that they own the voter, they own the Green voter, or we own the NDP voter. There's a lot of people that care about these same things. I think he did this appeal with federal Liberals when Kevin Falcon decided not to compete, right? Like he said, there's a place for you here. We share some of the same values. We want to work with you. If you care about these issues, we want to work on those issues together. So be with us. And I think he did something very similar with the Green open voter as well.
Well, there was quite a bit of fluidity compared to, the way electoral coalitions used to be constructed. And, so arguably some of those Green voters from previous elections found their way to the NDP. Certainly federal Liberals that still identify themselves as federal Liberals today, I think at least 2/3 of them probably voted NDP. And when you look at the city of Vancouver, 58% NDP in this election or thereabouts, winning big margin.
They had to have.
Winning in big margins, North Vancouver Seymour more than I expected. But on the other hand, some voters migrated away from the NDP. And in terms of the work ahead for the NDP, if there's a bigger majority to be found next time, who do you have in mind, a kind of a composite or a type of voter that you think, okay, we've got to go win this group back? We have to do more work with this type of voter.
Yeah, I think it is the suburban family, right? Like the parents with the kids probably still in school. They've got elderly parents. They've got the people who, these are the people who decide elections always, but particularly I think this time and for sure next time, that is a group of voters who, their economic interests, the interests of their family, their concerns about their future, like all of those things are very, very intensely felt, I think, for those folks. But they're also, busy with life and other things. And so they're harder to reach. They're harder to talk to. So it's a combination of they're important, but they're also tricky to connect with, right? So finding ways to do that, I think it's both the message, and the tactics that you really have to think about. What are the things that are going to help get that message through to those folks?
When I think about that group, which I totally agree with is critical, I think right away of Jody Wickens, who was recruited back to the team and once again was in a very, very tough struggle, but prevailed. And her whole life experience, her roots and everything are exactly what you're talking about. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, for sure. And we've got now in Surrey, we've got two, young-ish women. I say youngish. They're older than my daughter, but younger than me. And they're in Surrey, right? And so connecting with that group of people, I think those women are going to be super relatable to those people, right? Amna Shah and Jessie Sooner, right? They're living that life. They are, second, third generation from immigrant families. They're very connected to the community. They're themselves maybe starting young families, right? It's going to be an interesting it's going to be an interesting election 4 years from
So
now.
about 2/3 of the NDP caucus are women. Do you see
That shit don't happen by accident, Mike.
well, what can we expect to see as a result of that? Like, will we expect to see a different type of
I think so.
politics coming out of that from the NDP?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I love that 2/3 of them are women. And I think it's kind of a combination of things. I think it's generational change as well as having more women with a seat at the table. You know, the some of our new MLAs and some of our existing MLAs, like they have a really strong connection to community, but they've been leaders in different ways for a long time, but they also have different ways of communicating. Like Bowen Ma is a good example, right? Like she's a young mom with a cabinet portfolio, and a way of connecting with her community that's just really grounded. She's both present physically on her bike and she's present digitally on her social media, and really available and open and connecting with people. And I think that's super powerful. And I think we'll see a lot of that from this new caucus.
You've alluded to the fact that you're retiring, and Geoff doesn't seem to believe you.
Well, Geoff hasn't retired either. That's why he doesn't believe me, but I can do it.
Yeah, I know how hard it is.
So most recently you were heading government communications before the campaign. So it sounds like you're not going back there by the sounds of it.
Correct.
But, just to connect to your current experience to your career, what advice do you have for younger people who are considering or involved in a career in politics and will look up to you as someone who's run a provincial campaign to led it to victory here in this particular circumstance, but you've certainly been involved in lots of other winning campaigns. What's your advice to younger people?
I love that question because it's one of the favorite questions that I would get asked when I would go talk to students at university in my old job. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just get involved, right? Like everybody started this work walking into a grungy campaign office with like temporary walls and like shitty furniture and picked up a phone or picked up a lawn sign or picked up a post-it notes to create a board for E-Day or whatever it is. Like we all started campaigning that way, and that's the best way to do it. Like, I cannot tell you how many friends' kids I connected to be canvassers in this last election. Like, yeah, our kids are interested in politics. Like, we got jobs for people. We got opportunities for people. Like, get involved. And that's how I started. I had a friend whose dad was running for office, and I was going back to school, and I basically said, that was horrible. And he said, well, quit school, come work for me. I'm like, okay. like that's, it's a great, it's a great way to get involved in your community, but it's a great way to find a passion and like-minded people and find a way to realize the things that you want for your families and your neighbors and your friends. And it's not necessarily something that we see, right? Like this work, we all been doing it, but this work isn't necessarily visible to young people who are going to university and studying political science or something, right? Like you don't see this work, which is why, podcasts like yours are so great, right? It gives people a chance to kind of see that behind the scenes campaign work. Like put me on a ballot, never.
It's very, very
right?
glamorous too.
Oh yeah, it's very glamorous, super glamorous, especially in those shitty campaign offices. And right, but there's a ton of opportunity and ways of kind of finding your passion and your people and a way of giving back to your community. I mean, it's a public service, right? Like it is public service work in a different way.
Well, it's been a public service of yours to come to Hotel Pacifico today and share your insights with our listeners.
Pleasure.
Congratulations again on getting to 47. and please enjoy your
Don't
short-lived
jinx it, Mike.
enjoy your short-lived retirement. But we hope to see you again someday here at Hotel Pacifico.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Geoff.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Hamas, and this is Simon, and we live in Surrey. We started hosting on Airbnb because we thought we had the spare room, and why not share it with people? When our guests come in, first thing usually they ask is, I'm really hungry, it's been a really long flight, can you recommend a place? Usually Simon is really good with that. He knows all the good spaces. Because we got a lot of good reviews and people commented on the overall look of the space, I was like, okay, maybe I can do this for a living. It actually gave me the courage to start school in interior design. It made such an impact on us financially, and I don't know, I think we're happier because we started Airbnb for sure.
Learn more at airbnb.com/host. Well, we're here in the Strategy Suite. Geoff and I are joined today by our old friend Don Guy, the head and owner of Polaris Strategic Insights. Welcome, Don.
Highly qualified watcher of the recent election.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
What are you thinking?
Well, that was something else, I have to say. And I was up late last night watching the Saskatchewan results as well. So between BC, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan, I don't know about you guys, I'm exhausted. But
the main event is still to come south of the border.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Saskatchewan, the NDP gave it a good run last night, falling short by, 34 to 27 seats. So they're I think they doubled the number of seats, gave Scott Moe a bit of a scare, but he managed to pull it off. Mainly a urban-rural divide of epic proportions from the way I looked at it. I think all of Regina and Saskatoon, almost all of it went NDP, right? And all rural went Saskatchewan Party.
Yeah, I think and this comes back to, one of the elements we were discussing previously, which is this urban-rural divide, which seems to be getting wider and wider. And both the left and the right seem to be racking up bigger and bigger majorities in urban and rural. And the battleground is getting smaller and smaller.
But rural, I agree in part, Don, because the NDP here had lost Nathan Cullen and took a hit in some other places, hung on in a couple because of lucky splits and good candidates. But Mike has pointed out this sort of north-south divide in the urban areas, which has seen the Conservatives do very, very well in Surrey, and New Democrats do very, very well in the Vancouver, North Vancouver area. So it's not the rural urban in that regard. Do you think it's more demographic and class-based, or what's your take?
Yeah, it's a great question, Geoff. I do think it's demographic and life cycle based to some extent. I thought had a really interesting point about how hard it is to get a message out these days. And, compared to when we all used to gather around the 6 o'clock news. And if you got something out that way, into one news cycle, typically it was received and understood when it was being reinforced by print. The engagement with that kind of programming, those kinds of screens was, I believe, was much more than you get on one of these. I think it's something associated with how much is coming through this thing, and how hard it is to filter what's real and what's not real. And, honestly, it's a completely different medium.
So for those listening and not watching, Don's holding up his phone. And so are you saying that because people are, consuming their political news on a phone, they're not getting the information the same way they used to, like through television?
100%.
So they're what are they missing? Like what are you saying that they're missing here? The emotional impact of it, of like a TV ad, or what is it qualitatively? What do you think is different?
Well, I'd be really interested, and we're going in the field, Mike, as you know, with a kind of a post-election survey in BC, and I'm really interested in what did people actually hear that caused them to maybe reconsider another choice. You know, the big moving events here seem to have been Rustad taking over the leadership of the BC. Well, I mean, Kevin kicking him out, and then Rustad taking over the leadership of the BC Conservatives. That had momentum consistently all the way through till it reached a certain point where that momentum seems to have crested. And did it crest? What did it crest against? Did it crest? I think there were definitely elements of the NDP campaign that it could have crested against. But I think there were demographic and life cycle elements as well that it crested against. And in the end, in some of those ridings, you're right, Geoff. I mean, big breakthrough in Surrey, maybe not as big as they thought it was going to be. And so what were the things that they ran up against in terms of resistance?
Well, when you talk about the voter base that Horgan had, for example, in 2020 versus what Eby was able to put together, which was not a small thing. It's the second largest share of popular vote, I think, in the NDP's history, but it was distributed very differently. And I think as Marie de la Mattia was saying, it's important to decode what's behind all that, because if the NDP is to get a larger majority, which would certainly be welcome from the standpoint of House management and everything else, it's going to need some of those voters who wound up in the Conservative universe, and I'm not sure exactly how they'll find that.
Another way to look at the election results too, when you're talking about the north and south of the Fraser, Geoff, is and then you add to that the interior going heavy Conservative, and likely should have been 22 out of 25 had the Vernon situation worked out differently. Because I'm thinking about Surrey here and the Conservatives won Surrey, it's almost like an elite versus non-elite type of situation, where if you feel you are further away from the power center and the people making the decisions, you may have been less likely to vote NDP. And I think in the Surrey case, there's a sense that arguably that losing pace with growth, a lot of lower income areas as well, a sense that we're not being heard by those who are in power, and just a sense of just a little more disconnection from, say, Vancouver, where everyone knows in Vancouver controls everything, and we're close to, we've got downtown, and we've got UBC, and a lot of the decision makers are around the city of Vancouver. So I'm wondering if what we're seeing is not that dissimilar than what you see in the U.S., where the further you get away from the East Coast and California, you feel a little more disassociated from the institutions.
Well, we were kicking around some ideas, Mike, as you know, at Polera, in terms of what's the, is there one driving attitude? Is there a set of driving attitudes? How much of it is attitudinal and how much of it is issues? Which kind of, it gets to my point. In talking to some colleagues in the US, what they were saying is, that one of the big driver attitudes is the belief that regardless of how you're doing, that others are doing better than you. Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting. So it's not just that you feel you're doing poorly, even if you're feeling like you're doing okay. If you believe that others are being advantaged over you, it breeds a discontent that right now the right's message is connecting with more than the left's, and that's almost a complete swap from the kind of politics that all three of us grew up with, where it was usually the left's message that connected
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
with that attitude. And, you know, if we're thinking about how this could evolve in the future, and, you know, Geoff, to your point about how does EB expand the coalition, it might not be issues. It might not be issue based. It might be attitudinal based, alongside some of those kinds of metrics.
Well, I think way back in the past, and some of us will remember it, Trudeau had that discussion briefly, Pierre Trudeau I'm talking about, of reason over passion. I really think David Eby comes across as reason in a time when people want to see some passion, particularly if they're feeling that they're thwarted wherever they turn. They see dysfunction and misery around them, or their kids can't get ahead, or they're not able to get into a house that they can afford. Rustad, whatever he was saying, was passionate, whereas David Eby has a cerebral and more lawyerly approach, which was not connecting with a lot of those people who were hoping for more passion. And I think, you know, to your point on the attitudinal side, that's going to be a challenge, because the problems facing British Columbia right now are not solvable by a very quick, you know, policy intervention or some kind of gestural initiative of some kind that happens overnight. And you know, with an achievement like this, it is an achievement of a 47 seat majority, but it's not a stable long-term proposition. And even with the current outcome, I think there's plenty of rough water ahead unless they're very lucky.
Geoff, I think you just did a good job of queuing up the clipping of the week. So let's take
a look.
Let's give it a second for the music. Rob Shaw, he actually wrote this a day after the election, so it's actually a week old. But the title of the article is "David Eby lost this election even though the BC NDP won." And what Rob is saying in this article, he was saying the NDP was brought to its knees by a BC Conservative Party it argued was full of racist, homophobic, science-denying wackos, unfit to even run for public office, let alone hold it. Turns out not everyone sees the world through the lens of the moral superiority that the New Democrats do. Much of the NDP's trouble, I'm quoting Rob here, much of the NDP's troubles in this election can be traced back to 22 months of centralized, top-down, unilateral decision-making that occurred within EB's premier's office that was slow to recognize and respond to public outrage. Over 2 years, they ran unchecked alongside EB. They didn't notice as they drifted further and further out of touch with public sentiment. Can EB go back to this governing strategy? Are ministers and MLAs willing to take marching orders from the Premier's office that it turns out is not quite as brilliant as everyone thought it was? Now that's tough talk from Rob Shaw's analysis, but just taking from that, you know, there is this sense that was the NDP getting away from some of these voters it needed that had been with them in the past? And is this an operating style problem that can be remedied through a different operating style going forward to build a stronger connection back to those voters?
Geoff made a really, really astute point, I think, which is, and it's not just the left or the right. I think government tends to communicate on issues and from a policy basis, as opposed to connecting with how people are feeling. I mean, look at New Brunswick for that matter. You know, you could argue, and Mike, you and I have had this chat, if the time period from which Falcon walked across, wherever he walked across to that news conference to collapse the campaign, the NDP
He walked into an oncoming truck, I think, is what he did.
Yeah. Well, the NDP was clearly losing up to that point. In fact, our numbers, as you know, the Conservatives were ahead at that point. But the NDP won that period from the moment that happened through to the final count a couple of days ago. It looks like of that 9% that was left for BC United, you know, you spoke to this earlier, Mike, about 2/3 of it, 60% of it anyway, ended up voting NDP. So,
the federal Liberals was my point on that. The federal Liberals strongly went in favor of the NDP. But of those remaining BC United voters, though, which has included some federal conservatives too at that point, the federal conservatives were more likely to go with the provincial conservatives. But the federal Liberals were running the other direction, that were part of the BC United voter base. And I think,
but without getting with, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, I think the point we agree on is that at that moment in time when the deal was done, it was pretty much dead heat between the Conservatives and the NDP already. But the BC United electorate that was there, it didn't break in favor of the Conservatives. Like the voters that were behind BC United, they did not break towards the Conservatives. If anything, it was probably net advantage NDP. However, the real advantage of that deal was that Kevin Falcon wasn't in the debate. Kevin Falcon didn't show up to the campaign. Rustad had a clean shot. He didn't have BC United nipping at his heels the whole time.
Yeah, and we can all sit around and armchair quarterback. But if they were 2 points ahead, or I think it was 1.5 points ahead that morning when that event was held, and they ended up losing by 1.5 points, then something needs to be taken a look at. I also think EB deserves credit for the debate. I think the NDP had a very good debate strategy, and as all three of us know, and it's different when you're the incumbent. The test that a viewer has, or somebody receiving, information about clips or things like that for an incumbent is different than for the challenger. The incumbent is expected to be attacked and is judged for how they conduct themselves under attack. Whereas the challenger typically has to find a way to connect, and obviously had some challenges doing it that night. And, Geoff, to your earlier point, from that point forward.
Well, I think the NDP had a great post-debate strategy too. Like I think the only party we heard from after the debate was the NDP. The Conservatives took a day off and didn't do anything the next day, which I'm not sure why that was the case. But they didn't even try to make the case that Rustad won the debate. They just moved on, and the NDP were talking about how EB won the debate.
But I think the problem I know it's my job here to uphold the NDP side, and I'm doing my best, but I think it's also important to be very clear-eyed about it. As we've said today, there are many, many ways that the NDP could have lost this election under the same circumstances. A slight shift in Vernon, or Sonia Furstenau decides to stay home in Cowichan, and so on. And so as a tribute to Marie de la Mattia and the professionalism of their campaign, as well as all that other work that happened, that they were able to prevail. But that's cold comfort for an incoming administration. And I think, although I disagree with Rob on a number of points and wonder why he didn't write this column months ago, it's an important column because it points to the political function of government, which is to put yourself in a winning position. And execution has been a difficulty the government's faced on a whole bunch of fronts. It's true that the files are extremely complicated. The issues are complex, and the Premier would keep saying that. But people do not feel that they're incapable of understanding them, and they expect the government to come forward with concrete solutions. And I think that's a challenge for how policy and governance has been delivered up until now. It does pose some big challenges for the incoming team with the new front benchers they've got, the cabinet selection challenges that lie ahead, the decisions that need to be made right now to show, we heard something from the election and we're going to make this change that we can do quite quickly that will demonstrate we heard you. These are all very, very complicated matters, plus figuring out how you're going to manage the relationship with the Green Party. So very important reflection that's required here on the NDP bench, because while it was a victory and a good one, it was not an unqualified success. And I think, of course, the Premier is the person who has to work that through.
Well, we're all former chiefs of staff here and to a Premier. And so, Don, it seems to me that on the one hand, the NDP have been elected with a new caucus that arguably even tilts further to the left than the previous versions. They've lost a number of their moderates to retirement and in some cases defeat. So there's going to be this inside caucus and plus the Green vote talking about a few issues here. On the other hand, it's the message from the voters is different. And it's inside voice versus outside voice. And how does Premier Eby operate in that kind of situation where he might be being pressed on issues like on energy policy that expect him to take a maybe more aggressive stance on the environment, whereas many of the voters are thinking like, we're concerned about the economy, or we're concerned about they may become increasingly concerned about the deficit, even though it didn't come up much in the election. What do you think is a pragmatic strategy going forward?
You guys are closer to it than I am, but I do think that, Geoff, to your point, you need to move quickly to show that you've listened. And at the same time, I would not be walking around long-faced or, because, the Conservatives are going to come into the legislature acting like they won and bring in the fire. They're not likely to do much differently based on, the momentum that they had over the past year, to the point that we talked about. But I think these days, when people are so skeptical about government and about institutions, you need to find a way to, almost parse or break some of these bigger issues into measurable and understandable bites that you can make an impact on. So, I think all three of us have had this conversation in different campaign contexts, like the notion that we're going to go out and do something in 20 or 30 years, or that these are just not immediate enough for where voters are feeling the pain right now. So how do we, how do people who are in these roles of responsibilities in government, how do you make it real for people what you're doing and demonstrate to them that you're listening to them and having that impact? There's some different theories of government out there on how to do that, which, hopefully they're going to take a look at. Because clearly something does need to change. Well, and that's the other side of it. And Mike, to your point, right? The time for change numbers, that's, again, they deserve credit for the campaign that they had, because the time for change numbers were really high to re-elect an incumbent government. What they had going for them, partly because of what they were doing as a campaign and the run up to a campaign, is that, appetite for change was really high. The perception of voters that there wasn't really a better alternative was also really high. And that's a very frustrating place for voters to be. And I think, Geoff, to your point, that's where the opportunity is. Those voters who are feeling that, I want change, but I didn't see anything that connected with what I want and where I am. I'd be really drilling down into the demos and the life cycle variables in some of those voters, and that there's a huge opportunity there.
Yeah. And I think the critical thing is to resist the idea of stereotyping voters who voted Conservative, and make sure that you understand that the hunter, you may not understand why that person is going out to kill deer, but that hunter is a strong conservationist and has a very profound environmental values, and connect and keep alive to the fact that a lot of people, including even on issues, cultural issues like SOGI, for many families who historically supported the NDP, the SOGI issue is a troubling and difficult one, and they don't. We got to be careful not to assume that says more about them than exactly that. So that's a tricky line to walk.
Now, the conservative opportunity for the next time voters go to the polls seems pretty straightforward to me. Hold the interior, which the NDP didn't put up much of a fight in the interior this past election. And we've talked ad nauseum about Vernon. That's a seat they should win next time if they set it up properly. The Conservatives, that is. And then, if I'm the Conservatives, I'm going to try to hold the fort in Surrey, but look across the Fraser River to that Burnaby to Maple Ridge belt of ridings, which is 12 ridings. They won one by 99 votes, I think, in Maple Ridge East. Can they get more out of there? They should, arguably Coquitlam, Burke Mountain, maybe even Port Moody, Maple Ridge, Pitt Meadows, maybe Burnaby North. Those would be ridings I would target now. And look ahead, whether it's 2 years or 3 years or 4 years from now, is to build something over there. And then you got to look at Vancouver, Yaletown. You got to look at Langara, maybe even Fraserview, back over to North Van Seymour, and then can we get more out of the island? So the Conservatives didn't miss by much in some of these places. Some of these places it was a candidate issue. It was just they came too far, too fast. If they have more time, they can do that. And can they take the edge off of the Conservative offering?
Mike, I couldn't disagree with anything you said, but it's a very sound technical plan.
Yeah.
What Angela Isidoro, the executive director of the Conservatives, has said is we have set out to replace that center-right formation that was BC United, BC Liberals. They were sissy Conservatives. They don't count at all. We are going to be full-blooded Conservatives and not in the center. Centrism is dead. So there's a political argument and appeal to the voters that they're going to have to work through in the near term as well. And I don't think that's going to be a simple task because they have BCU veterans in their ranks, like Peter Millibar and Trevor Halford, just to name two, who are going to be deeply uncomfortable if they can't find a path forward on racism, for example. So I think it's going to be an interesting time ahead because if Angela Isidoro's view and John Rustad's view is that this marks a total departure in political strategy, then we'll see a different animal than we had under Kevin Falcon by a long shot.
Well, the mark of a winning party is when you can have people with strongly held views decide to work together, and that remains to be seen. The Conservatives have come a long way, but it will not be the same next. They can't fight the next election like this election. They got to fight it for what it is, whenever it happens.
It's not getting along with strongly held views to say I can't be in the same room with someone who's overtly racist, like the recently defeated Conservative candidate Wanda Fuka-Malahat. That's a ridiculous stance for a party to put forward. We'll see if they do. But I agree with Marie, our guest, that's a very difficult argument to make in the context of an election. Over a period of months and weeks, as people watch these debates occur in the Conservative ranks, we'll learn more about where the electorate really wants to go. But that doesn't take the NDP off the hook for making a better proposition in the next round and in the weeks to come.
Okay. Well, let's take it to the minibar.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I'm glad I can get off the coffee toasting now and get back to booze, but I'd like to raise a strong glass to Gary Begg, who's carried Surrey Guildford. And it was surprising to me that turned into a battleground, but I think that the fact that someone who had long community roots, was a senior RCMP officer in Surrey for many, many years, and many other connections to the community, was successful is not surprising in retrospect, but I'm very glad for Gary Begg because, of course, he helped the government stay in power, but also he's been one of those very, very important but invisible backbench MLAs who was the whip and did serve all kinds of important roles within caucus. And now I assume he'll see a chance to serve on the front bench. So congratulations to Gary Begg.
Well, I would raise a toast to both of you and your colleague, Kate. I think the work that you folks did during the campaign, that it was an experiment, but I think it was greatly valued. I know I valued it. I've talked to tons of people who valued what you did. And you're out there breaking new ground in terms of how we're going to be talking about these things in this country going forward. So congratulations. It took some stones to stand it up and to do it the way you did it. And I think it worked out really well.
Thank you, Don.
Well, thank you, Don.
Yeah.
Well, Geoff and I were at the Webster Awards last night, where their local media here in British Columbia were feted, and there was no podcast category for political coverage. Therefore,
Oh, that's a
Geoff
huge
and I
gap. Huge gap.
did not come home with any hardware last night. Unfortunately, I regret to inform our listeners. Hint, hint, Webster's next year. But I do want to salute a glass to the media that were represented there last night and were nominated. And there were some interesting stories told. And I did notice that Richard Zussman, though he was up on stage quite a bit collecting awards last night, did not win an award for the pronunciation of serpentine. So he, in fact, received a -1 for that, and his 2 awards were reduced to 1 award because of his disemboweling of the English language during the campaign. Also wanted to raise a glass to the people of Nanaimo. Geoff and I and Kate were there last week speaking to the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance at a live Hotel Pacifico, and had some great feedback. Appreciate the conversations we had with folks who were there, and certainly a lot of engagement in post-election discussion for people who now live in a swing area. There's lots of swing ridings on north of the Malahat, Vancouver Island. So take advantage of it, Nanaimo. You've got clout. I'd like to thank TELUS, Fortis BC, and Airbnb for their ongoing support of Hotel Pacifico. And listeners, see you next week. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.